Okay, so this is going to be the first part of chapter 26. There are going to be several different parts, but we're talking about the renal system. So really, when we're talking about the renal system, we're talking about the kidneys, but we're also going to move through the ureter and into the bladder for a very briefly at the end. So in this section, we're just going to talk about anatomy and blood flow because one of the purposes of the kidneys are to filter blood. Now it helps to get a big picture of what's going on. We know that we have blood, and we know that that blood is moving stuff around. We know that the cells in our big toe need oxygen just like everything else in our body. So that means we have to have a way of getting that oxygen down there. And then we also, they're cells. So they're doing stuff. There are chemical reactions going on, and they're producing things that can't remain in the cell or it gets toxic and they'll die. So we need to get those things away. So that's what our circulatory system is for. But all of those toxins that build up in there. We can call them toxins because they're chemicals that aren't supposed to be there that ultimately can be harmful, but we need to get rid of those. And so the liver does that and the kidney does that. Now, carbon dioxide, of course, we know we breathe it out, so that's where it goes. So it helps to kind of have that big picture. Um, One of the other things that happens is that we eat, when we consume food, we end up taking in a lot of extra stuff. The digestive system doesn't say, oh, yeah, we don't need sodium right now, so we're not going to take in sodium. No, it absorbs all of that sodium, and that ends up in our body. And so we need to get rid of that. So things like potassium, sodium, even hydrogen, which can regulate pH, all of those things are kind of gotten rid of. We get rid of those through the kidneys, okay? And we'll talk about many other things too that are used that the kidneys get rid of or filter out, I guess is the best way to say that. Okay, so functions of the urinary system, like I said, filtering of blood. So we have those two kidneys, one on each side, and that's going to involve three processes. And you're going to have to learn the names of these and what they mean. But filtration, that's like if you filter something, if you put something through a filter, that means you're basically just screening it out. It's kind of like when you cook broccoli or something like that, if you want to get the water out of it, you filter it, okay? Reabsorption always means that it's going back into the blood, okay? That's what reabsorption is. It means it's going from some kind of a uh, lumen, which is an open space, back into the blood, or we can just absorb things through our body, but this is reabsorption, so it's already been there once, it's just being reabsorbed back in. And then secretion. Secretion means that it's going from the blood into a lumen, or it's going out of the blood. That's another way to say that. So secretion means that it's going from the blood somewhere else, okay? And excretion is what's left in the kidneys, and that will ultimately just be it's urine, so it'll just leave the body as urine. Okay, so another purpose, and this is a really important one, and this is why the kidneys are so important and why they're important for diseases and drugs, and that is the regulation of blood volume. Most of the drugs, now think about what that means. Blood volume, fluid volume in the body. If we drink a lot of water and have a lot of salt, all of that stuff's going to be in our body. And that means that we're like little water balloons that are being pumped up. And so that's increase in pressure. So we have more pressure inside our body. Well, that's blood pressure. We measure that as blood pressure. And so all you have to do is, and I'm obviously oversimplifying here, is flip a switch and let some of that water out, and that decreases the pressure. That makes sense, right? You have all this water pushing in a confined space, that is our bodies, and so all you have to do is let the water out. Let the water out, the blood pressure goes down, the fluid pressure goes down. And that's what a lot of drugs do that regulate blood pressure, is they just make us pee more. We call those diuretics. Okay, so this is directly related to overall fluid volume of the body. We either urinate it out or we keep it in. That's pretty straightforward. Concentration of blood solutes. So, like I said, digestive system doesn't always get it right, and our diet choices don't always get it right. So sometimes we have to adjust how much sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, phosphates, and there are others as well that are pH is a big one, but I have that one listed right here. So pH, extracellular fluid, pH of the extracellular fluid, and that we use that by secreting hydrogen, okay, and CO3 minus, and then we have bicarbonate also, okay. All right, so that's mainly what we're doing. I mean, those are the things that we're going to be talking about. All right, so we need to, first of all, like I said, this is all part of getting that big picture. I know this isn't the anatomy part of the class, but we have to get that big picture. And so we have to understand the anatomy of the renal system. This is kidney anatomy, and we'll get into the actual kidneys. But this is more the urinary system. So the kidneys are there. They're filtering the blood, and they will then move into the ureter. So, well, the kidneys don't, but the fluid that's inside the kidneys, if it's not reabsorbed back into the body, if that doesn't happen, then that fluid will just continue and it will move through the ureters down into the urinary bladder, and it will fill up and then move through the urethra as urine. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about blood flowing into those kidneys, and then you collect everything that you want to keep in the body, move it back into the body, and then whatever's left moves through and becomes urine. Okay? So, a few things. So, the renal artery moves right off of the abdominal aorta. So, here's the abdominal. I'm going to change colors here. Here's the abdominal aorta right here. And then you have the renal artery, and the renal artery is going to push blood into the kidney. And then that blood will be filtered, and all of those, the filtration, the reabsorption, secretion, all happens in there. And then if it's not taken back into the body, then it moves through these ureters, into the bladder, and out as urine. Okay. So renal artery, renal vein. Oh, and then the blood. of course, you're not taking all the blood and turning it into urine. So some of it is going to be returned back, and that goes back through the renal vein. Okay. Down here, it says here that kidneys are retroperitoneal. Well, retro means back or previous or something. I don't know. Retro music is, I don't know, I think 70s music is retro music. It's back then. And the peritoneal cavity is this little cavity right here. It's outlined in blue. I'm now writing it in black. But it sort of goes around here, and that's what keeps your guts in for the most part. Okay, most of them, your intestine and all that, your intestines, your stomach, your pancreas, are all inside the peritoneal cavity. Well, the kidneys are weird because they actually sit behind it. Okay, so they're actually behind the behind the peritoneal cavity, so we call them we call it retroperitoneal. So it sits towards the back, so this is the back down here. Okay, and that's obviously the front, or anterior, posterior. Okay, so now let's look. So we kind of have an idea now where things are and what's going on. So now we can kind of look at how the kidneys do what they do. So we're going to get into some of that anatomy. Now, if you look at this, it's not horribly complex when you think about what's going on. Okay, so you have blood that's flowing in. Again, I'll go to black. You have blood that's flowing in, and then it divides into these tiny little arterioles. Remember that word, arterioles. So it divides into these arterioles, and then it will form something called a nephron. And I don't have a picture of a nephron in here, but the nephrons kind of sit up here, and they dip down into this thing called the medulla. Okay? They dip down in there, and they form, and that's what they're doing, is they form this medulla. So the cortex is always the outer part, and that's where the nephrons start, and then they dip down and they form that medulla. Some of them dip down really, really deep into it. Okay, that's going to help you concentrate urine. We're going to talk about that. And some of them don't dip as far down. Okay, so the cortex is the outer area, and then there's the medulla, which is this area in here. And the medulla will form what's called a renal pyramid, and that's what this is showing. It's supposed to be Somebody said it looks like a pyramid. To me, it looks like a guitar pick. But either way, it's called the renal pyramid. And so it's a cone shape. It's cone shaped. And the base of it, we call this the base, is that boundary between the cortex and the medulla. So this is your renal pyramid here. Calyces. So remember, what's going on is we're filtering blood. So this blood is going to be filtered out. Of course, we don't want blood cells to be in your urine. You don't want that at all. And so that's one of the things that gets to stay. Okay, so that moves back, and it moves back into the veins, and then leaves as the renal vein. But in the process, what's going on is you're constantly producing urine. Okay, and these things called collecting ducts. And so this urine will drip into this pelvis, or the calyces, and then they move into the renal pelvis, which is down here. So what your kidneys are doing is they're constantly, you have all of these nephrons. There are like 1 million of them in the kidney, and they're constantly dripping out urine. And the urine will move through these calyces, and then they move through the renal pelvis. Okay, and then they drip, drip, drip down into the bladder. Okay, so that's what's going on. So if that makes sense to you, which I hope it does, blood moves in, and then it goes to these nephrons. There's filtration. The blood, some of the blood just bypasses it, but all of the blood cells bypass it. But some of that fluid will move into the nephron, and then it will pick and choose what it wants to keep, and that'll be reabsorbed. And then it's just sort of dripping out urine. Okay, so blood is filtered by nephrons dipping into the medulla from the cortex. Filtered blood moves through the major and minor calyx to the renal pelvis and the ureter as urine. Okay, so blood supplies. So what are we talking about? Kidneys are less than 0.5% of the total body mass. That means they aren't much, but they receive 20 to 25% of the resting cardiac output. Now, if you think about that for a minute, they're getting almost a fourth of what your heart is pumping out. That's what cardiac output is. It's how much blood is your heart pumping out every minute. They're getting a fourth of it. So that means that obviously not all of that is going to become urine. But it kind of makes sense, since the role of the kidneys is to filter this blood and make sure that there aren't bad things that the kidneys have control over. The liver, like I said, does other stuff, but it's filtering out certain things and then turning those into urine. So the left and right renal artery enters the kidney, branches into these arteries and arterioles. Okay. Now we have a close-up. So this is what we were talking about earlier, or what I was trying to talk about. This is a nephron. I wrote that poorly. So this thing right here is a nephron. All of that. That's a nephron. And so that's what this branching that I was talking about earlier. It branches, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, each one of these forms an arteriole, and that arteriole is going to move into something called a glomerulus. Okay, and that's how you say that, glomerulus. And that glomerulus is just this ball of capillaries. Okay, it's a capillary ball, and that's all it is, just this mixed up tiny little capillaries. And so that's where the actual filtration will take place that we're going to talk about. Okay, and then not all the blood is filtered out. Okay, so you have filtration and things will move into the nephron, but some of that blood will just simply go back out into the efferent. So you have the afferent, which means it's going in, and then then there's filtration that takes place here, and some of that fluid, not the blood cells, but the fluid will ooze into this nephron. And then the rest of the blood that doesn't make it through will go and leave through the efferent arteriole, and then it's gonna go out of the kidney through the renal vein. Okay, so it divides into the glomerulus, the capillary ball. About 20% of the blood entering the glomerulus goes into the nephrons. Okay, so 20 to 25%. We were talking about how much goes to the kidneys alone. Well, each individual nephron, about 20% of that blood's actually going to be filtered through. The rest of it moves back out through the efferent, and that leaves through the renal vein. Sorry. So reunite to form the efferent arteriole, And this is what's weird, is that we have learned that it goes artery to arterial to capillary, and then where does it go? It goes to venial, usually. But the kidney is unique because it actually goes arterial to capillary, back again to arterial. Okay, so that's different. Okay, all right, so there are about 1 million nephrons in each kidneys, and that's really what the kidney is. So when you look at this, so right now you just see maybe a complicated organ, but when you think about it, all you've got is a blood supply going up, it's feeding these nephrons, and these nephrons are forming all this other stuff, okay? So all of these little nephrons are what's making that up. And so the nephron is really what's doing the filtering. It's what's doing all the work, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about when it comes to the kidneys, okay, are these nephrons. And then you've got these calyces and this pelvis where all the fluid, or, well, it's urine now. The urine is moving in and then through the ureter. Okay, so let's look even closer, and really we're going to stop even looking at the kidney. All of our time is going to be spent looking at these nephrons. Okay, so nephron, the functional and histological unit of the kidney. So functional, we know what that means. That means it's, well, in this case, we know that it's filtering it. We don't have the details yet. Histology, that just means what you can pretty much look at, the type of tissue. Not too worried about that. But this is what it is. And so when we look at the anatomy, and these are things you're going to have to know, is that it forms something called a Bowman's capsule, and I'll have a better picture of that coming up later. But it forms the Bowman's capsule, which is this capsule here, okay, and that has the glomerulus in it, okay. So the Bowman's capsule surrounds that capillary ball, and then the glomerulus is inside that. Together, those are called the renal corpuscle, by the way. And then it moves to, so let's say that something was filtered out. Again, it's like a sieve or like any kind of a filter. Let's say that fluid starts to move into the nephron tubule. Okay, so that's what I'm kind of drawing here. This is the nephron tubule. This first part of it, is called the proximal tubule, or the proximal convoluted, because convoluted just means all mixed up, and it's kind of squiggly. Okay, so the first part is the proximal convoluted tubule, and then it will dip down into something called the loop of Henle. Okay, and that's how you say that. So there's going to be, obviously, a descending limb and an ascending limb. Okay, all right, and then it gets to the end, and now we're at the distal tubule, or the distal convoluted tubule, and those will then drain into collecting ducts. And you can see that there are lots of nephrons, okay, that are draining ultimately into more of these collecting ducts. And that's where you have the drip, drip, drip of the urine. So this guy's working. So this one that we have all marked up here, he's working, trying to make urine, drops it into the collecting duct, and it moves down here into the calyx of the kidney. And this guy's doing the same thing. And so they're all dripping out their tiny little humble portions of urine to make enough urine for you to have something to do when you go to the bathroom. Okay, because that's why we make urine. So we have something to do in the bathroom. All right, so types of nephrons. There are cortical. Remember, the cortex is the outer area, and then the medulla is the inner area. So cortical neurons just mean that they aren't as deep. So if you look at this guy over here, he's only going in a little ways, okay? So his loop of Henle. So that's really what we're talking about, is the loop of Henle. Okay? So they don't extend deep into the medulla if you're talking about cortical. They spend, almost half of them are in the medulla. However, there's also something called the juxtamedullary nephrons, and the juxtamedullary nephrons take that plunge, and they go all the way deep into the medulla. That's where their loop of Henle goes, and then they go back out. And there's a very important reason for that, and that's because there's a higher concentration down deep in the kidney. Okay, and that's something that hopefully we'll understand because it's the core of why we can make either very dilute urine or we make concentrated urine. It's because it's high concentration down in here. That means there are a whole lot of particles, very, very concentrated and thick, I guess you could say, although that implies, yeah, anyway. But there are a lot more particles down there. Okay, not as many up here. It's a lot more dilute up here. Okay. All right, so then what's going on? I'll pull all of these together. So how is it cleaned? Well, this is what we're talking about. The afferent arterial blood moves in, okay? So this is blood that's moving in, okay? And then filtration occurs, okay? And when filtration occurs, then we end up with fluid that moves into the nephron. Now I changed color to green because you wouldn't be able to see yellow very well, but that's essentially urine at that point. It's not though because there are still good things in there, right? A ton of water is moving in with that. So here's the blood flowing in. 20% of that, I mean, that's a lot of water. You would lose water very, very quickly if it all just stayed in there. So then we have something else called reabsorption. And so a lot of that water, most of that water, almost all of that water will be reabsorbed back into these things called peritubular capillaries. Peri just means around. So there are capillaries surrounding these things. And so when the nephron gets this and says, "Okay, seriously, you want me to just pee all of this water out? I think you're going to need it." Then the peritubular capillaries are up there saying, "No, no, no, just kidding. We want that water." Okay, so we want to keep that water. And we might also want some sodium back, and some potassium back, and some calcium back. Okay, so that's what's going on. And that's what reabsorption is. Because if you look, once fluid or once anything enters into this nephron, it's a one-way trip to, well, to the toilet. Okay, because that's going to be excreted as urine. So we have to reabsorb stuff. We have to. Now there's something else that takes place, and that's secretion. Okay, so secretion, remember, secretion is from the blood into a lumen, or it's just out of the blood vessel. Okay, so there's also secretion. So sometimes something might get past. Okay, so let's say there's some bad thing here that we wanted to get rid of, but it managed to get past it. Okay, well, there's a backup system here where that could be secreted and it could end up back into the nephron and then excreted as urine. So that's not as important. Well, okay, I can't say important because you die without it, but it's not as complex as the reabsorption is. So we'll spend most of our time talking about reabsorption. Okay, so reabsorption happens kind of all the way along. Different things are reabsorbed. Sometimes we reabsorb salts, sometimes we reabsorb water, but it takes place all along. Okay, secretion is a little more specific. You don't have a lot of secretion in the loop of Henle, but it does take place. And then there is excretion, and that is where we make urine. Okay, so then in the next section, we're going to start getting into some of the details of how all of these processes take place.